On this year's Earth Day, the Biden administration just announced they are going to cut the United States CO2 emissions in half by 2030. This commitment is being praised by many media outlets as bold, ambitious, aggressive, and even fierce. Personally, I think the words toothless, ineffectual, lazy, and half-assed are far more accurate. Now, why is this? Well, the plan doesn't actually cut emissions in half. This is because the levels of emissions they are cutting in half are not based on current levels, but CO2 emissions from 2005. This is a terrible benchmark to use, as 2005 is one of the United States' biggest years for carbon emissions on record. Combine this with the fact that our emissions have generally been decreasing since 2005, with a 14% decrease in emissions between 2005 and 2017. So if we're using 2005 as the metric, the Biden administration has, by default, already met a significant part of this goal without having to lift a finger. With this context, we can clearly see this climate plan does not have much in the way of ambition. This seems to be a theme of Biden's administration so far. They announced an initiative or executive order that appears to be bold and progressive, but with any amount of examination can quickly be unmasked as minuscule reform that does little, if anything, to address the issue at hand. This is almost always followed by the media fawning over these non-reforms, and he'll get called FDR.2 or whatever. Another good example of this is Biden's student debt cancellation. Sounds great, right? The reality is he canceled less than 1% of the total student debt of the country. Look at this pie chart. You see that tiny little bit there? Yeah, that's what he canceled. While student debt is effectively crippling a generation, the climate crisis is a far bigger threat, and any half-ass measure is far from acceptable. Look at a more environmentally focused example of the media covering for Biden's half-ass measures. Once again, sounds great. The reality is, prior to the suspension, he approved loads of new permits. The suspension is also only applicable to certain areas, and it only lasts 60 days. Even with all that, there are workarounds for oil and gas companies to use to get new permits. This is due to the fact that under this new suspension, high-ranking members of the Cabinet of the Interior can still approve new permits. In other words, this suspension really isn't a suspension. But let's assume that the Biden administration was actually cutting emissions in half. Will that be enough? No. Carbon dioxide levels are now nearly twice pre-industrial levels, and they are the highest they have ever been in about 3 million years. Back then, sea levels were a whopping 25 meters higher. This means just about every major city on Earth is already at risk of being submerged with our current CO2 levels. Not future CO2 levels, but what's currently in our atmosphere. This, of course, doesn't take into account the other greenhouse gases we're emitting, that are far more damaging to the climate than carbon could ever hope to be, like methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride. Gases the new plan doesn't even address. Needless to say, we have very little in the way of time. In fact, we may not have till 2030. The reality is we need to be taking action that is actually ambitious. We need to take rapid steps that ensure we're not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative. Rebuilding the world and reorganizing society after the COVID-19 pandemic to effectively suck out carbon from our atmosphere is really the last decent shot we have at beating this crisis. Of all the places in the world, Bhutan has been an example for the world to follow. This country is the only on Earth that has become carbon negative, taking measures like banning logging exports and providing free renewable electricity for its citizens. They were able to achieve this transformation fairly quickly. So, if this small Asian country, with a GDP of $2 billion can do it, why can't the richest country in human history? Perhaps the Biden administration isn't particularly well informed on the reality of the climate crisis, and is operating under the delusion that this will be enough to overcome it. Perhaps the Biden administration is prioritizing larger financial interests over the well-being of life on Earth in a hideously misguided attempt to preserve the status quo. I honestly wonder if announcements such as this climate plan, or student debt cancellation, are just them throwing a bone to a populace they again and again failed throughout the years. A populace that has grown more contemptful, distrusting, and violent towards them, as they fail to bring anything other than incremental change to their lives. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is this plan is not in any way going to cut it, and more serious reform is needed if we want to prevent what is shaping up to be the single most cataclysmic stage of human history. I guess my question is this: do they honestly believe they are helping to fix the climate crisis? Or are they knowingly manufacturing an illusion of change to maintain the power of a wealthy elite who fail to realize that climate change is a fire that will burn us all? There is only one fear I have about this entire situation. One single, simple thing. I am terrified nothing will fundamentally change. On the other hand, Boris Johnson thinks this whole plan is pretty awesome, so, it's got that going for it.